I'm Linda Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation about education in Cuba today. After decades of isolation from the U.S., Cuba is once again welcoming Americans to its beaches, restaurants, cultural attractions, and perhaps its schools. This tiny island with its meager economy has an amazing success story. Nearly 100% of its citizens are literate. In 2011, I visited Cuba as part of an educator's tour. Since then, Cuba has become even more accessible. In the summer of 2015, a group of faculty from Hostos Community College visited Cuba. They met with Cuban educators and public health officials to talk about and share practices and challenges. Today, 2 colleagues on that trip join me for a candid conversation about Cuba today and what these educators learned from each other. Welcome back to part 2 of our program devoted to education in Cuba today. My guests today are Professor Elys Vasquez-Iscan of the Education Department at Hostos Community College and Professor Lisa Tappeiner, librarian in charge of collection development and technology. Thank you for staying for part 2 of this program. We ended part 1 by looking at education and the philosophies of education in Cuba in terms of younger children. And I know that one of you had mentioned that Jose Marti, the Cuban educator and philosopher, really sees childhood as a golden age. And I think in our conversation we spend a lot of time looking at how children are valued and how their education really points to the whole person. So now let's focus on what happens as kids get older and they think about higher education, which of course is our CUNY interest, and I'd like very much to hear what you thought about higher education in Cuba. Where did you visit in terms of looking at higher ed?
Well, our big trip was to the University of Havana, which looks like an old European university. We sat in a very old room and talked about how it's similar to ours in that there are many different departments. Students are applied to different schools or different departments, and it's very selective. Havana is the most selective university in Cuba.
So in terms of higher ed, who participates in higher ed? In the United States, we are trying to make higher ed accessible to more and more people. We're really pushing. How does that compare with Cuba?
So in Cuba, students are tracked at the secondary grade school. They're based on their achievements, academic achievement. They're either placed in a track for vocational education, professional technical education, or pre-university education, which from there is where they would go on to the universities. The percentage of people that go into the university clearly is not as high as those in vocational and technical. It is a very competitive admissions process. Although it's free, it is very competitive.
How is tracking determined?
They have to take a test. They have to take an exam. But regarding tracking, they look at their whole academic accomplishments from the 1st grade up until the 9th grade.
So explain that again. So what's the role of the test vis-a-vis looking at the whole academic record?
So the test is to enter the university. Okay. But from the 1st grade to the 9th grade, they're tracked to see their abilities, academic abilities. And if they show progress and if they show promise, then they would be given the opportunity to enter the pre-university track. If not, then they would be placed in vocational or technical.
So not everybody even takes the test?
No.
Is that
Yes.
correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so they already kind of tracked at a very early age
Yes.
to determine who even gets to take the test.
Yes.
And then once you take the test, then that determines if you do indeed continue on to university?
Right, and it doesn't guarantee. If you don't pass the test, then you would have to, option into technical or vocational.
And what are some of the vocational paths that are available?
It's the vocational path that they have are basically to work for the state, whether it's in agriculture, plumbing, electric. In the technical professional, you can have secretarial positions, administrative positions, tourism, teaching assistants.
I can hear, again, a little voice in my head, a lot of objection to this very early tracking of students. Is Cuba trying to address this in some way? Are they working on making higher ed more accessible? In what ways? I know you said you went to a session on remediation or developmental education. What was that about, Lisa? Do you remember? what the emphasis was?
Well, one way I think that they're addressing this, I mean, I know he was an educator kind of at the government level. He was sort of an educational policymaker. I can't remember his name, but he spoke to our group. And I know that he's trying to, in fact, he spoke with the president of our college about, the community college model, but how Cuba can kind of make more options for people later, kind of after they've not succeeded early on in their education.
So how do they do that?
Well, I'm not sure how they're doing it. I think they're looking at options for making kind of evening schools available for people, for working adults. And I think there are some of those kinds of programs in Cuba, but kind of broadening out those sorts of offerings so that people who maybe didn't do well early on in their educational careers can go back and have a second chance at or retraining themselves if their career becomes obsolete. But I'm not, I don't have, I know that's an interest of theirs. I don't know specifically how they're doing it at this point.
The other point I just wanted to add with what Lisa said is that the workforce, the slots that they have, the opportunities in the university slots are based on the demand of the workforce. So the difference in Cuba, one of the clear differences in Cuba and the United States higher educational system is that when you go into a university profession, you are guaranteed employment upon completion.
In Cuba?
In Cuba. You actually are placed in a position after you graduate.
Right.
But is it always related to your major in higher ed? Because that was not what I saw.
Not necessarily a major, but if they have, for example, if they know that they're going to need 50 physicians, they're going to open up 15 slots for students to enroll in that program. Where in the United States, whoever wants to be a doctor, they just apply to the program, and if they get in, they get in. It's not based on the demand.
Right, like law school and all those things.
Right.
But so I see a plus and minus to that approach. On the one hand, they're limiting the numbers by saying, we only need 50 of you, and so, so then that assures that those 50 have jobs. And I thought Cuba is known for producing more doctors than it needs. Or are you talking about sending their doctors out to other countries in South America?
They do.
I heard that's what
they do.
I don't know if doctors are unemployed, but there's certainly
but they're not
a lot of doctors
working in Cuba.
They're not all working in Cuba, and there's a really, we'll talk about this later, I think, but there's a very, very robust sort of primary care infrastructure in Cuba. So I think per capita they have quite a few doctors.
Meaning what in terms of primary care? Everybody has health coverage.
Everyone has health coverage, and there's a big emphasis on preventative care and community and family practice. So doctors work kind of in the neighborhoods. They're not sort of segregated in hospitals or in, they have their little practices in a house in a neighborhood. So I think that, I don't know the statistics, but I think that there's just a lot more doctors around in Cuba.
Cuba is very well known for its medical schools and the doctors, the high quality of the doctors produces. The irony in Cuba is good health care, but no Band-Aids. They lack some very basic things. Let's go back to higher ed and what you might study when you go to higher education. What were the majors that you saw? What were the lack of majors that you saw? What impressed you about higher ed?
Well, they have a very strong science program in the natural sciences and mathematics. But what they do lack is marketing. There really doesn't exist, that concept.
Not because it's a communist country?
Probably it's not really
there
a
isn't a
profession
place for marketing in Cuba at this point in their society, so they don't offer marketing as an option. They do have technology. What they have challenges with is accessing all these new technological resources. And so one of the things that, when we went on the tour to the University of Havana, we asked about, how many hours of internet do you have access? How do your students that are in, computer engineering or computer science, how do they have access to technology so they can practice? And, what we were told is that, the United States may have all the resources technologically wise, but we have the human capital, and we have that will, and we will be innovative as far as getting access or getting the training that is necessary to be a computer scientist.
In our show in 2011, we had the opportunity to speak to 2 Cuban scholars here at Lehman College and CUNY. And I'd like you to listen to what they said in 2011, and here it is 2016, and tell me what your reaction is, okay? Let's take a look at the first professor.
one metric that I looked at, just in general, out of my own interest in education in Cuba in particular, was enrollment, the growth of enrollment, but also the graduation rates. And graduation rates in Cuba, I have to say, are very impressive. I mean, you have pretty close to 100% graduation rate. Pretty close means about 99, 98%. In Havana, it's very high. In the urban centers, it's very high. Also, another metric that shows you more about the condition in Cuba of education is the percentage of people who graduate from urban districts, urban schools versus the non-urban population. It's the same as it was in 1961, which basically tells you that the country has reached its optimum urbanization level. The data shows you that in the countryside, the schools are also showing a high graduation rate. When you look at different provinces, in eastern Cuba, traditionally, the graduation rates have been lower. That trend remains pretty much unchanged. I mean, the graduation rates have increased, but they don't match nearly what's been recorded in Havana. So you see those discrepancies there. Education in Cuba, the quality of it, there's an irony behind it, because you do see the quality of it. I talk to young people in the university who are studying economics, and they're doing intro to micro, and they're doing the calculus of indifference curves and utility functions. I mean, they're doing things that in other parts of the world, including here, we do, we teach in grad school. At the same time, there's, Cuba, as any other country, has to migrate towards a knowledge-based economy. And the current situation is such that access to the principal source of knowledge, which is the internet, is highly restricted. So that is counter, that is a policy that's having an impact. Because on the one hand, you're educating, and from primary schools, you have a very good system of education. Of course, the system of education is guided by these principles of universality, of service to the state, right, loyalty to the revolution. But the quality, nonetheless, is very good. Then you have a very good system of higher education, but then there's a gap between the theory and the practical skills. And part of that gap is the lack of access to the internet, expanded access to broadband technology. I mean, Cuba has just recently signed an agreement with Venezuela to expand broadband technology, because as you know, there's an issue of access from the United States, right? But nonetheless, and I do see already inside Cuba the drive to open up more, to increase access to the internet, but to do it gradually. Remember, the political connotation of these openings is pretty strong. So what Cuban officials have said to me during my visits is we're changing, we're updating our model, but we're doing it with certainty, but gradually.
So that was 2011. Does it still hold today? What's your response?
I mean, my sense is yes. There's not widespread access to the internet. It's access to online resources is at a premium there. I know that someone told us that every department in the university, every professor has access to the internet, but how much? And certainly in terms of student access, I don't know. I doubt they use the internet very much in their studies on a daily basis, the way they do here.
Our personal experience was very limiting, right?
Yeah.
We
Yes.
only had internet from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So if you didn't get on the internet,
each other aside.
It was brutal.
It was brutal,
right?
yes.
Yeah, we
and
had
it
to
wasn't
buy little
always.
cards.
It wasn't always sure. It wasn't always
Yeah.
guaranteed that you would have it. It wasn't always available. But that's the time frame that you could, if it did happen.
So in 2011, we are told that the officials are saying that change will come, it will be gradual, but it will happen. Do you see some evidence of that opening up, of that change? Because as he says, opening up means a lot. It's it's a loaded thing when you open up a country.
I think that it is happening, and we're seeing it with the exodus of educators leaving the educational system.
Where are they going?
they are going into tourism, which is a very lucrative area in the economy. Right now, they have access to higher income. Our tour guide, when we were in Cuba, was a former high school teacher, and she is fluent in English. And an English teacher, so she is fluent. And the thing about educators in Cuba is that they are able to navigate in different sectors of society. They can be in the history sector, they can work as historians, they can work as tour guides, they can work in management, because they are very well-rounded. Their preparation is very well-rounded. So the challenge that is occurring right now is that educators are leaving the education field for better opportunities.
So that'll be a problem. Clearly, that's
Yes.
a challenge. Now, you talked about the liberal arts and this idea that people are able to negotiate different careers and travel down different paths, and yet at the same time, this idea of getting a job is so important. How did you think Cuba is doing in terms of navigating this tension, perhaps, between the liberal arts and the workforce?
I think that with Cuba, you know, they study a field that will lead to a job. It's very connected. Studying and the workforce are very connected.
What about the literature major? I mean, my tour guide was a former literature major.
Well, I think a lot of those people would go into education. And then, as Elys said, as more opportunities open up in the tourism field, they leave education, they leave, I mean, there's two economies. There's the CUC economy, which is based on the dollar, and that's much more lucrative. And the people in the tourism industry have access to that currency. Doctors, teachers, government officials all live in that other economy where they really don't make as much money. They make much, much less money. So I think they might start, you know, having a liberal arts education and wanting to be an educator, but they really aren't able to earn a living, aren't able to support their families. So then they move into the tourism economy. That's certainly what we saw.
Here they move into STEM.
They do.
We think everything answer to everything financially is STEM.
Not yet.
What were the top fields that you saw for people that they wanted to go into?
Medicine.
Medicine. And what else?
And tourism. People wanted, you can open up a restaurant called a paladar, and you can, they have casa particulares. I saw that in the western part of the country, where you can rent a room or part of your home to tourists. But you could, clearly people wanted to learn English and interact with tourists, because that's where the money was coming from. I think that those are fields people now seek to get into.
And it's posing a challenge for students, for teachers in the classroom. How do you keep a student in the classroom and encourage them to go on to the university or to go on and get a vocational training when their friend has dropped out of school and now is working in the tourism sector and is being paid in dollars?
Now, we also spoke with another professor here at Lehman, and he had a somewhat more negative take on how things are progressing there. And this, again, was an interview we did in 2011. So let's hear what he has to say.
Well, I think that my views of the educational system in Cuba have shifted along with my sympathies or lack of them for the Cuban Revolution and the political process that is the Cuban Revolution. And some of the claims that the revolution has made are a bit distorted given the historical background. In 1959, when Mr. Castro triumphed, Cuba had one of the highest literacy rates in all of Latin America at the time. And indeed, during the course of the 20th century, literacy continued to increase, and it had an educational system which was probably one of the best in Latin America and the Caribbean at the time of the triumph. So that does not mean, however, that there were not high rates of illiteracy in rural areas. It does not mean that the educational system did not serve all of the Cuban people, and I think what the Castro regime did was to extend education to regions on the island where it had not existed before. I can temper those comments, laudatory comments, with some broader perspectives, which have to do with my changing attitudes and views toward Cuba in general and Cuban education in particular. And I'll be very to the point here. What good is literacy when there is nothing to read? And I think this is a fundamental question that those who applaud Cuba's literacy achievements simply don't deal with. And so my question is always, as an intellectual, what good is literacy if you do not have the free choice as to what you, as an individual, may read? The answer to the question is, on one hand, you can have a high degree of literacy and a high degree of education. On the other hand, there are broader questions that need to be posed, and that is, what kinds of freedoms do human beings have to utilize these kinds of skills? Cuba is a sad, 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 sad case in the Western Hemisphere. There have been dictators that have come and gone. There have been regimes that have been authoritarian and extraordinarily repressive. There's been extreme censorship imposed in many countries throughout the hemisphere in the 1970s because of military dictatorship. But those things have passed. An age of openness, of democracy, whether you agree with it or not, has come, and Cuba is unique in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is the only nation whose people are entirely, for all practical purposes, cut off from information, cut off from the outside world.
That's a somewhat harsh assessment, certainly, and I want to know how that jives with what you saw.
I mean, I think that we can't ignore the gains that the revolution has had with the literacy campaign. One of the groups that highly benefited from the revolution were females. When you look at college-educated professionals, half of them are females. When you look at medical professionals, 69% of them are females. When you look at the racial breakdown of the educated, you can see that the Afro-Cubans have highly benefited from the revolution because they have had access to education, because the premise of the revolution was to provide social equity.
Right.
With the opening now of an open market, these gains in education, in access to medical care are going to be undergoing considerable stress.
Now, go ahead, Lisa. I mean, this idea of having access to things, I could read really well, but what is there for me to read? What did you see when you looked at bookstores or?
Well, yeah, I went into the university bookstore, the University of Havana bookstore, just out of curiosity, and it is really limited, you know, compared to a university bookstore here. The offerings just for leisure reading are pretty limited, and then also their course textbooks. I was sort of surprised. There's a lot of Marxist-Leninist course textbooks, and so yeah, I mean, I think that there is clearly a problem with access to information. On the other hand, I didn't see a lack of a life of the mind in Cuba. You know, I saw a lot of very highly cultured people, very well-educated people, people who are engaged politically, people who are engaged with their own society. It didn't look sad, as your previous guest said to me. It seemed that people were very intellectually engaged. So yeah, I think there's a problem, but I don't think having unfettered access to the internet is necessarily what the solution needs to be, and I don't see it as a country that's closed or uninformed. It's a very sort of internationally minded place. So yeah, I didn't totally agree with what he had to say.
We only have a minute or two left. I want to ask you quickly about public health. What did you notice about public health education and about public health in general?
Well, with health education, it's embedded in their educational curriculum from the first grade. So children have access to health services within the context of the classroom, and they have access to health information, which impacts health outcomes in the general population, because you can see how the infant mortality rate is 4 per every 1,000 live birth. In contrast, in the United States, we have 25 per every 1,000 live birth. And you can even see the contrast where before the revolution, infant mortality was 60 deaths for every 1,000 live birth. So it has had an impact in the longevity and the health outcomes of the population.
And family planning, is that?
Family planning is very highly used. Everyone is very knowledgeable of sexual reproductive rights, and to the point that the natality rate has decreased.
They consider that a problem.
They
Their
consider
low
that a
natality rate.
It's a low rate.
Yes.
Yes. So their pyramid, when you look at a society's, I guess, creation, it's upside down. You have a larger group of elderly people living longer, and then you have lesser numbers of children being born.
In the seconds remaining, I want to ask you, based on your visit to Cuba, what can the U.S. do to promote positive change?
Well, I know what the Cubans said over and over and over again is to end the embargo, to open up normalized economic relations with Cuba, and for us to lobby our government representatives to end our economic sanctions against Cuba.
Right. I think what the Cuban society holds on to, their social gains, education, and medical care are things that they have highly valued. And I think with the opening of the Cuban market, the United States is going to have to respect those social gains and not try to create a market-based economy or enforce or promote a market-based economy that does away with education the way it is now.
And that'd be real hard for us. I want to thank you so much for this highly informative and candid conversation about education in Cuba today. Thank you so much, Professor Elys Vasquez-Iscan and Professor Lisa Tappeiner from Hostos Community College. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We'll be back with our EdDBytes. Welcome back to this edition of EdDBytes. It's not uncommon to see teens yawning in the morning, begging for more sleep. There's already been discussion about starting school at a later time to better match students' circadian rhythms. But could a later start actually boost student test scores? The Huffington Post reports that students who start school later in the morning watch less television, spend more time on homework, and have fewer absences than students who start school earlier in the day. They also have higher test scores. Researchers see clear increases of academic performance from just starting school later. Does it seem that good-looking people just get more advantages? Women certainly feel judged on their appearance. So, how important is it for women to be attractive in the academic setting? A recent study conducted at Metropolitan State University of Denver finds that attractive female students earned higher grades than unattractive female students. And the results were true whether the faculty member giving the grade was male or female. For male students, looks didn't seem to matter. It's noteworthy that the grade gap disappeared when courses were taken online. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Till next time, class dismissed.